Welcome back, everyone, to the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. I'm your host, Wedge. Today's episode will be the 10-minute report Browns. Before we jump in today, please make sure you follow me right here on Spotify as well as on Instagram at Wedge52Gridiron. And go ahead and check out any of my other episodes posted right here on Spotify. I've been posting a 10-minute report every single day for the month of July. If you guys are unfamiliar with the 10-minute report series, that is where I take 20 minutes of study plus my already established knowledge to create a 10-minute podcast. With that being said, let's jump into today's episode, the 10-minute report on the Cleveland Browns. Leading off with their quarterback situation, they recently acquired, before last season, Deshaun Watson. I'm sure this is a familiar signing that everyone knows about by now. I do not agree with the amount of money or the fully guaranteed contract that the Browns gave, but besides that, last year Watson, in 6 games that he played after serving his suspension, he had 1,100 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, 5 interceptions on 58.2% completion percentage, and the Browns went 3-3 in the 6 games that Watson started behind center. So obviously, these numbers are very poor quarterback numbers for Deshaun Watson, for any quarterback, but for Watson last season. And it kind of, he hadn't played a game in over 700 days when he started last season for the Browns. Because, he was out for the entire season and then served an 11-game suspension. So Watson, the Browns are certainly hoping for him to figure it out and get back to, at least a good level starter for them. And, ideally return back to close to his numbers that he was able to accomplish in Houston. But we will see. I personally don't think it's going to happen. It does not seem to work out in the players' favor very often when they sit out for a year plus and try and come back to be in elite status. And I do not think the AFC North will be friendly to Watson's chances. In 2020, when he was with the Texans, he did lead the league in passing yards. However, the Houston Texans were 4-12 that season. All right. Moving on to the Cleveland Browns offensive line. They do have a top 5 offensive line unit, in my opinion. It's, of course, led by left guard Joel Bitonio, who has been, the cornerstone of that offensive line for quite some time now. He kind of took over that role, especially after the retirement of Joe Thomas a few years ago. But last year, Joel Bitonio was first-team All-Pro yet again, his second of his career, as well as he has 3 second-team All-Pros. Last year, Bitonio only gave up 1 sack and 4 penalties. As for the rest of the line, left tackle Jedrick Willis Jr. had 6 sacks and 10 penalties, so he struggled at times, but they're hoping he can, get it back to consistently. Center Ethan Pocic had a breakout year for Cleveland after, not having a season as good as he did last year with the Browns during his 4 years in Seattle prior to last year. He only gave up 2 sacks and 1 penalty. Right guard Wyatt Teller, who's been very good the past few years. Bitonio and Teller, potentially the top guard duo in the NFL. I haven't studied up on, guard duos, but I would imagine they are up there. Last year, he gave up 4 sacks and 6 penalties. And then right tackle Jack Conklin only gave up 2 sacks, but he did struggle with penalties as well, with 10 last season. And that's kind of their passing numbers. As well as last year, the Browns were 10th in yards per rush, as well as 5th in rushing yards per game. So a very solid offensive line, and the tailback behind them that we'll talk about in a second. But I would expect the Browns to rely heavily on that offensive line, not only for the rushing game, but to help Watson try and become better or back to better. Nick Chubb, running back, like I just mentioned, has been a stud, one of the best running backs in the league since he's came in, really. Had 1,525 rushing yards and 12 touchdowns last season, earning him a second-team All-Pro selection. And then their offensive weapons, receiving weapons, Amari Cooper had 1,160 yards and 9 touchdowns last season. Donovan Peoples-Jones had 839 yards and 3 touchdowns last season. Elijah Moore, they acquired him from the Jets. The Browns received Elijah Moore and the 74th overall selection that for the draft that happened in April. And for that, they traded away their 42nd overall pick to the Jets. But last year in New York, in a very busy wide receiver room, definitely led by Garrett Wilson for the Jets last year, Elijah Moore still was able to get 446 yards and 1 touchdown. And then, of course, they have David Njoku, who's been a solid tight end for them, has shown flashes. Definitely not in that top 3, top 5 conversation, but he is not far behind, especially with the flashes he shows. Last year, he had 628 yards and 4 touchdowns for the Browns. Moving over to the defensive side, they started off by acquiring Zadarius Smith from Minnesota. They received Zadarius Smith, a 25th 6th round and a 25th 7th round pick. And in exchange for that, they traded away their 2024 5th and their 2025 5th round pick. So kind of a low cost, high reward pickup by them that I think was very solid. Zadarius Smith, edge rusher, obviously had 44 tackles, 10 sacks, and 15 tackles for a loss last season. So I think this is a very solid pickup for the Browns that gives them a very good pass rushing duo on the edge. Once again, after Jadeveon Clowney went elsewhere during free agency this offseason. Of course, I'm talking about Myles Garrett on the other side of the defensive line there, who had 60 tackles, 16 sacks, 18 tackles for a loss, and 2 forced fumbles last season. Myles Garrett is one of the best defensive end rushers in the league. Last year, he was second-team All-Pro. And then in the middle of that defensive line, it's going to be Delvin Tomlinson, who they also signed from Minnesota on a 4-year, $57 million deal. He had 42 tackles, 2.5 sacks, 3 tackles for a loss, and a forced fumble last season for the Vikings. And then, their linebacking core is not very solid, but they are hoping that linebacker Anthony Walker returns to form from 2 seasons ago. He was dealing with an injury last season, only played 5 games, I think. The year before that, he had, I want to say, close to 130 tackles in 12 or 13 games. So they're hoping to get a healthier Walker back to kind of help out that, middle of the defense kind of thing. And then they have cornerbacks Denzel Ward, who played very good last season. He had 33 tackles, 3 interceptions, 15 passes defense, and 2 fumble recoveries, which he returned both of them to the end zone. Led the league last year in fumble recoveries for a touchdown with 2. So Denzel Ward, definitely solid cornerback. And then on the other side, they have Greg Newsome II, who last year had 42 tackles and 6 passes defense. On the back end of that, they have safety Rodney McLeod, who they just signed to a 1-year, $1.3 million deal Last year, McLeod played for the Indianapolis Colts and had 96 tackles, 2 interceptions, a touchdown, so one of those was a pick six, and 8 passes defensed. Very solid numbers for their secondary with those 3 guys at least. And then obviously their edge rushers are very good. So kind of their main weakness on defense is going to be that interior defense line as well as linebackers. But that wraps up all the time we have for my 10-minute report on the Browns, which leaves me with just one thing, and that is my 2023 record prediction for the Cleveland Browns, where I predict they will go 7-10. Thank you all for listening to the 10-minute report, Browns. Make sure you guys check out some other 10-minute reports up here on my Spotify channel, as well as press that follow button so you can be tuned in for all future Wedge 52 Gridiron podcasts. Once again, thanks for listening, and go Ravens.